Allison Moore had always imagined that moving into a well-maintained, private residential community would be the final step toward a calmer, more predictable life. After years of running a small but beloved vintage bookshop in the city, she had saved enough to buy a modest, neatly kept house in a neighborhood that promised security, tidy streets, and a slower pace. The move was not just for herself. Her mother's health had been fragile for years, and the proximity to a good hospital and quiet surroundings felt like a necessity rather than a luxury. From the very first day, she noticed how the residents seemed to know each other's routines and how nothing ever seemed out of place. On the surface, it looked like the sort of environment where conflicts were rare, but underneath that calm exterior, Allison quickly sensed an undercurrent of tension, a kind of watchfulness that went beyond simple neighborly concern. The first time she met Jason Clark, the community's president, it was on the narrow brick walkway in front of her home as she was bringing in a small delivery. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere, a tall, clean-cut man with an almost rehearsed politeness in his voice and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He welcomed her, asked how she was settling in, and without pausing began making small but pointed observations. How she might want to adjust the position of her trash bins, how the front light fixture was a slightly different style than the rest of the street, how the neighborhood valued visual harmony. It was framed as friendly advice, but Allison couldn't shake the feeling that he was cataloging details about her and her home. In the weeks that followed, Jason's presence became a constant, if subtle, part of her daily life. She would see him standing near the community center entrance as she drove by, his gaze following her car. Other times he would pass by on his golf cart at a slow pace, tipping his head in a greeting that felt more like silent evaluation. Still, she told herself it was just his way of being thorough in his role, and perhaps he treated everyone the same way. It was only during the first monthly residents' meeting that the undercurrent became harder to ignore. In front of a room of strangers, Jason singled her out over what he called a non-compliant mailbox replacement. His tone was sharp but coated with formality, claiming that her new box did not meet the design standards, even though Allison had a receipt and photos showing it was identical to her predecessors. The moment was brief but humiliating. She noticed the sideways glances from other residents, the small murmurs, the way Jason moved on to other topics without giving her the chance to respond fully. Later, a neighbor she barely knew approached her outside and quietly said, "Don't take it personally. He likes to test the new ones." The words were meant as reassurance, but instead they felt like a warning. From that point on, Allison began to realize that this wasn't just about a mailbox or neighborhood aesthetics. It was about control, and Jason seemed to take a particular interest in making sure she understood where she stood in his version of the community order. What Allison could not have predicted was how quickly things would escalate from pointed comments and public embarrassment to something much more aggressive, something that would leave her questioning not only her safety but the intentions of a man who appeared determined to make her life in this new home far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. It was a warm, late afternoon when the tone of Allison's life in the neighborhood shifted from uncomfortable to unmistakably hostile, and the change came in a way that was so abrupt and so deliberate that she would replay it in her mind for days. Afterward, trying to understand how someone could cross that invisible line without a flicker of hesitation. She had been running errands in the city, picking up supplies for her shop and stopping at the pharmacy to collect her mother's medication, and by the time she returned, the sun was beginning to sink low, casting long shadows across the streets and giving the rows of houses a serene, postcard-like appearance. She decided to make one final stop at the community's small clubhouse, where packages too large for the narrow residential mailboxes were held for residents, and parked her car in one of the open spaces near the entrance. It should have been a routine, thoughtless task. Walk in, collect her parcel, drive home. But as she stepped back out of the building holding a medium-sized box, she saw Jason's golf cart positioned at an odd angle a short distance away, idling as if waiting. He wasn't looking at her at first. He seemed to be studying something on his phone, but the moment she approached her vehicle, his head lifted, and he began steering the cart toward her space with a slow, deliberate pace that felt like the opening. Move in a confrontation. When he stopped beside her, there was no greeting, no pretense of neighborly civility. Instead, his voice carried an edge so sharp it almost startled her, accusing her of disregarding the community's safety rules because he had received a report that she drove too quickly down one of the residential lanes the previous evening. Allison, already tired from the day, told him firmly that she had done no such thing and suggested that perhaps he had been misinformed. The words had barely left her mouth before he was leaning slightly toward her, narrowing his eyes and making a pointed comment about how residents who start bending rules early usually keep going until they're a real problem. It wasn't just the accusation that unsettled her. It was the tone, the implication that he had already decided she was guilty of something and that this was not a conversation, but a statement of his authority. She kept her composure, unlocked her car, and began placing the package on the passenger seat, thinking the encounter was over. That was when she heard the low growl of the cart's electric motor surge as Jason swung it around in a tight arc, then accelerated directly toward the front of her vehicle. For a split second, disbelief rooted her in place, and she thought perhaps he was simply pulling past her in an unnecessarily close maneuver. But the speed and the directness of his path made the intention impossible to misinterpret, and instinct took over. She dropped into the driver's seat, twisted the key, and jerked the wheel hard to the right, jumping the curb and bouncing onto the neatly manicured edge of the lawn beside the parking spaces. The golf cart skidded slightly as he braked, coming to a stop where her car had been seconds earlier, and she could see him through the windshield, his face set in a mask of irritation that looked almost satisfied. The moment passed in seconds, but the shock lingered in her body like the aftermath of narrowly avoiding a collision on a highway. Her pulse hammered in her ears, her hands shook against the steering wheel, and a cold clarity cut through the confusion. This was not a misunderstanding or an accident. Someone doesn't accelerate toward another person's vehicle in a confined space by mistake. As she maneuvered her car back onto the pavement, Jason sat still in the golf cart, watching her with an expression that was neither apologetic nor defensive, but something closer to appraisal, as though measuring the effect he had achieved. Driving away, she debated pulling over immediately to call the police, but the tangle of adrenaline and disbelief made her doubt whether she could even describe the event clearly without sounding irrational. She told herself she would go home, write everything down while it was fresh, and decide on her next step once her thoughts were ordered. But the decision was made for her later that evening when she opened her mailbox and found a sealed envelope with her address written in a precise, almost mechanical handwriting. Inside was a printed notice, formatted to look like an official fine, citing her for property damage to landscaped areas, with a photograph of tire tracks on a lawn, clearly the lawn she had driven over to avoid the cart. The notice demanded immediate payment of a penalty fee and bore Jason's signature in ink. Something about the document was off, though. The letterhead looked slightly blurred, as if it had been scanned and reprinted, and there was no reference number or payment method listed other than a vague instruction to deliver the amount to the community office. The implication hit her with the same cold jolt she had felt in the parking lot. Not only had he provoked her into a situation where she was forced to drive over the grass to avoid a collision, but now he was using that manufactured outcome as a weapon against her, cloaking it in a veneer of bureaucratic legitimacy. In that moment, any lingering hope that his earlier actions had been a lapse in judgment evaporated. This was calculated. It was a deliberate escalation, one that blurred the line between personal animosity and abuse of position, and if she let it pass unchallenged, it would not stop here. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table with the false notice beside her, Allison understood that the nature of her life in this place had changed in a way that could not be undone, and that the next move she made would determine whether she became an easy target or someone worth leaving alone. Allison didn't wait long before deciding that the incident couldn't be left as an isolated note in her own mind, because if she treated it like an unpleasant but forgettable confrontation, Jason would interpret her silence as consent, and that thought alone was enough to push her into action. The following morning she gathered the notice, the envelope it came in, and a sheet of paper on which she had already written a detailed account of what happened in the clubhouse parking lot, including the time, the weather, the approximate distance. Between their vehicles and the fact that his cart had stopped exactly where her car had been moments before she swerved, she drove to the local police substation just outside the community's main gate, a squat brick building with an unassuming entrance, and asked to speak with an officer about filing a report for a traffic-related threat. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged man whose uniform seemed too tight around the shoulders, read through her account, asked a few clarifying questions, and eventually explained in a measured tone that, while her statement would be recorded, proving. Intent in such cases was difficult without independent witnesses or video evidence. The words were careful, almost bureaucratic in their detachment, but the implication was obvious. Without something more concrete, her complaint might go nowhere. Allison thanked him, took her copy of the report, and left with the uneasy sense that she had stepped into a process designed to grind slowly enough for people to lose interest. Still, the act of filing had value. It created a paper trail, and she suspected that sooner or later she would need that. When she returned home, a dark green sedan she didn't recognize was idling a few houses down from her driveway. At first, she thought it might belong to a visiting neighbor, but the moment she slowed to pull into her garage, the car eased away without signaling, disappearing around the corner. It might have been coincidence, yet it layered onto the unease that had already been building inside her. That night, she called a local attorney, a woman recommended by a supplier she trusted, and arranged an appointment for the next day. The attorney, sharp-eyed and direct, skimmed the notice Jason had sent and pointed almost immediately to the same irregularities Allison had noticed: the blurred letterhead, the lack of an official payment channel, the absence of any internal reference number. "This is not how legitimate notices are issued," she said, tapping the page with a polished fingernail. "And, if it came from him personally, rather than through the actual administrative office, it's essentially a personal threat disguised as policy." She advised Allison to keep all correspondence, to respond only in writing, and to send any reply via certified mail so there could be no dispute over whether it was received. Taking that advice to heart, Allison composed a short but precise letter stating that she disputed the fine, that she had filed a police report regarding the incident in the parking lot, and that any further communication on the matter should be directed to her attorney. She made 2 copies, mailed one to the community's administrative address, and hand-delivered the other to her lawyer for safekeeping. The next day, as she was leaving for her shop, she found Jason standing near the corner of her property, holding a tape measure and a small notebook, carefully measuring the strip of grass between her walkway and the curb. He didn't look up as she passed, but the deliberate nature of the act was obvious. That evening, a neighbor she barely knew stopped her to ask in a slightly hesitant voice whether she had been having trouble with Jason. When Allison asked what she meant, the neighbor admitted that Jason had mentioned she was causing complications, and that her behavior might need to be addressed at the next meeting. The combination of calculated appearances at her property, the spread of vague accusations, and the lingering possibility that he had allies willing to carry his version of events unsettled her more than any single act of confrontation. It was no longer about a moment of road rage or a single questionable document. It was about positioning her in the eyes of others as a problematic presence, someone who might be watched more closely, someone whose credibility could be eroded before. She even realized it was happening. That realization hardened her resolve. She would not let him dictate the narrative, and she would not respond emotionally in ways that could be used against her. From then on, she began maintaining a log not only of direct interactions, but of anything unusual. Cars idling too long on her street, unmarked envelopes in her mailbox, conversations where her name came up in an oddly rehearsed tone. She informed the attorney of each entry, and while the lawyer told her some of it might never be actionable, It was part of building a context, a pattern that could later demonstrate sustained harassment. Meanwhile, the false fine remained pending, and though she knew she had no obligation to pay it, the knowledge that it could be paraded in front of others as evidence of unresolved violations was enough to keep her on edge. It was within this atmosphere of quiet siege that she began to understand the way Jason operated. Not through loud public conflicts that could be easily challenged, but through a series of smaller, plausibly deniable actions that, taken together, formed an oppressive, inescapable pressure. He didn't need to shout to make his presence felt. He only needed to stand at the edge of her lawn with a notebook, or drop an irregular document in her mailbox, or mention her name in just the right tone to the right person. And that was when Allison realized the next stage of this would not be a matter of if, but when, and that she had to be prepared for it to arrive in a form she might not immediately recognize. By the time the next residents' meeting approached, Allison had already learned to expect that Jason would find some way to frame her presence as problematic, whether through a direct accusation or a subtle suggestion laced into unrelated topics. She had debated skipping the meeting entirely, avoiding the atmosphere of orchestrated scrutiny, but her attorney advised her to attend and remain calm, both to ensure her side of events was represented and to observe whether he would escalate in a way that could later be documented. On the evening of the meeting, she arrived a few minutes early, taking a seat near the back of the long rectangular room with its pale, echoing walls and the faint hum of overhead fluorescent lights. She had brought a slim folder containing her dispute letter, a copy of the police report, and photographs she had taken of the falsified fine notice, though she hoped she wouldn't need to produce them unless provoked. The meeting began in its usual dry fashion, with discussions about landscaping budgets, minor maintenance projects, and seasonal events, and for a brief stretch Allison thought perhaps she might slip through unnoticed. But then Jason, seated at the head table with a poised stillness that always seemed calculated, leaned toward his microphone and announced that he wished to address a matter of ongoing concern regarding vehicular safety and property compliance. Without naming her directly at first, he described a recent incident in which a resident had maneuvered recklessly in a shared parking area, causing damage to community landscaping. As the words unfolded, he shifted his gaze deliberately to where she sat, and the implication was as loud as if he had spoken her name. She could feel the weight of several pairs of eyes turning in her direction, some curious, others already colored by whatever story he had been circulating in private conversations. Allison waited until he finished his recitation, which included a thinly veiled reference to delays in resolving the associated penalty, before she raised her hand and, in a steady voice, asked to respond. When he granted her the floor with a faint, humorless smile, she explained that the maneuver in question had been a defensive action to avoid a direct collision with his golf cart, that she had filed a police report immediately afterward, and that she had disputed the fine because it lacked the formal elements required of any legitimate penalty issued by the administration. She didn't raise her voice or allow herself to sound agitated. Instead, she spoke with the measured precision her attorney had recommended. Jason's expression shifted only slightly, the barest tightening around the eyes, but she recognized it as the flicker of someone caught off guard by a target who refused to respond emotionally. He replied with a tone of condescending civility, suggesting that memories can differ, and that in the absence of definitive proof, the matter should remain a private discussion between the involved parties. The phrase was a calculated move, designed to pull the issue back into a less visible arena where he could control the narrative. But Allison simply nodded and said she was happy to discuss it further with her attorney present. That small addition landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating a ripple of murmurs among the other residents. After the meeting adjourned, Allison made her way toward the exit, hoping to leave without further interaction, but found Jason already positioned near the door, engaged in casual conversation with two board members. As she passed, he broke away just enough to say, in a low voice meant only for her, "You're making this harder than it has to be." She didn't break stride, but the quiet venom in his tone stayed with her long after she reached the safety of her car. The following morning she awoke to find an unmarked envelope slid under her front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with no greeting or signature, only the words, "Rules are rules, no exceptions," typed in a generic font. It was almost childish in its simplicity, yet chilling in its anonymity, and while she had no doubt it originated from him, the lack of any direct attribution made it another act of plausible deniability. She scanned it, emailed the file to her attorney, and added it to her growing log of incidents. That week, a subtle shift began to take shape. Small inconveniences emerged that were easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore collectively. Her trash collection was mysteriously skipped one morning, despite every other house on her street being serviced. A delivery driver claimed he had been told by someone in charge that packages for her address should be left at the community office instead of her doorstep, forcing her to make an extra trip. And twice she noticed that the entry gate's access arm remained stubbornly down when her vehicle approached, lifting only after an unusually long delay. These were the kinds of disruptions that left no obvious fingerprint but eroded the rhythm of her days, each one a reminder that the ground beneath her was not entirely stable. It was during one of those delayed entries at the gate that she happened to glance into her rearview mirror and saw Jason's golf cart stopped about 50 feet behind her, not moving forward, not signaling any impatience, simply waiting. When the gate finally lifted and she drove through, he followed at a leisurely pace, turning down a different street before reaching her block. It was enough to set her pulse racing, not because of the overt act itself, but because of the unshakable sense that he wanted her to notice. One evening, just after closing her shop, she returned home to find a small orange stake driven into the strip of grass near her driveway, marked with a number in a thick black marker. She had never seen such markers used in the neighborhood except before maintenance crews performed work, and when she inquired with the landscaping company contracted for the area, they confirmed they had no scheduled service for her property. The stake was gone by morning, but its purpose, whether to signal something to someone else or simply to unsettle her, remained unknown. By this point, Allison understood that Jason's strategy was not to force an immediate confrontation that could be cleanly addressed, but to maintain a steady, low-grade pressure, weaving disruptions and implications into her daily life until she either complied with his demands or made a mistake he could exploit. It was a war of endurance, and the midpoint she had now reached was not a moment of relief but a recognition that the pace and subtlety of his moves were calculated to stretch the conflict indefinitely. Her challenge was no longer just to respond to each incident, but to find a way to break the pattern without giving him the ammunition he was quietly waiting for. The shift from Jason's slow, methodical pressure to something more direct happened on a wet, wind-swept evening when the air was thick with the smell of rain, and the streets of the community shone dark and slick under the streetlights. Allison had stayed late at her shop, doing inventory for a shipment that was due the following week, and by the time she pulled into the neighborhood, most houses were already quiet, their windows lit from within like small, private worlds. As she rounded the curve toward her street, her headlights caught a sudden obstruction. A golf cart, parked crosswise in the narrow lane, its headlights on but no one visibly inside. She slowed to a stop, gripping the wheel with both hands, and scanned the area, the thrum of the rain on the windshield amplifying the stillness. She was just beginning to consider backing up when she caught the faint glint of movement in her side mirror. Another golf cart, rolling slowly up behind her. This one was driven by Jason, his face barely visible beneath the shadow of his hood. For several seconds neither vehicle moved, the first blocking her path ahead, the second cutting off her retreat. It was an arrangement so precise it could not have been accidental, and the enclosed, rain-slicked silence made it feel like a scene engineered for maximum intimidation. Then, without a word, Jason pulled his cart forward just enough to pass her, the brush of his gaze through her driver's side window as fleeting as it was deliberate, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the bend. The cart ahead remained in place another moment, then was driven away by someone she could not identify. She drove home with her heart pounding, her mind turning over the obvious coordination of what had just happened, and the fact that there had been, again, nothing concrete to report beyond a description that could be dismissed as coincidence. The next morning she woke to find that the iron gate to her side yard, normally secured with a latch she always kept locked, was standing open, the damp grass inside marked by 2 distinct tracks of flattened blades as though something heavy had been dragged through. Nothing appeared stolen or damaged, but the intrusion was unmistakable. She photographed it, closed and locked the gate, and sent the images to her attorney with a note describing the blocked street the night before. By now, their email thread had grown into a detailed record of incidents that might have seemed absurd to anyone viewing them in isolation, but, when lined up together, formed a pattern too exact to be random. Later that week, the harassment took a new form, when a folded sheet of paper was slipped under her windshield wiper while she was parked at the grocery store. It bore a typed list of supposed violations under her address. Everything from non-standard exterior lighting to yard debris in common view, each one a fabrication yet formatted to resemble an official inspection notice. There was no signature, no letterhead, just the list and a final line. Compliance required within 7 days. She kept it, scanned it, and refused to respond, knowing that acknowledging it directly could be twisted into an admission of some kind. Jason's next move was more public. At a small weekend gathering near the community center, she overheard him in conversation with 2 residents, speaking just loudly enough that his words reached her where she stood several feet away. He was telling them about certain people who didn't seem to respect the community's rules, implying that some newcomers acted like the rules were for everyone else. The deliberate vagueness was the kind that allowed him to infect perceptions, without ever naming her outright, and when one of the residents glanced toward her mid-sentence, the point was made without him having to say another word. That same night, as she returned home, she saw a fresh note taped to her front door. This time, it was handwritten. The letters, sharp and angular, reading only, "Some problems don't go away by themselves." She didn't remove it immediately. Instead, she photographed it from several angles, bagged it in a clear sleeve, and stored it. With the rest of her growing archive, it was no longer just about her word against his. She was building a file that could speak on its own. But the culmination of this phase of escalation came 3 days later when she returned from work to find 2 orange traffic cones placed at the edge of her driveway, as though blocking entry, and a printed "Notice of Temporary Access Restriction" taped to one of them. The notice claimed that her driveway required inspection due to possible subsurface damage, and that no vehicle should use it until clearance was given. It was absurd on its face. There was no mechanism for such a restriction to be issued unilaterally, but the implication was chilling. Someone had entered her property to place the cones and tape the notice while she was away. She stood there in the fading light, rain beginning to spit again from the low clouds, realizing that the balance had tipped from covert interference into visible, physical obstruction of her daily life. And yet every move still hovered in that gray space where intent could be denied, and each act by itself might seem too minor to demand immediate legal action. But together they were a steady march toward something she could no longer afford to treat as a battle of wills. Jason was testing boundaries, escalating the pressure with every turn, and the line between harassment and open provocation was beginning to blur in a way that could only lead to a more dangerous confrontation if she did not find a way to stop him. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon when the sky hung heavy with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, the air damp and charged as if holding its breath. Allison had left work early, hoping to settle in before the weather turned, but as she approached her street, she noticed Jason's golf cart parked at the far end, angled toward the main road as though lying in wait. The sight brought a tightening in her chest, a mixture of dread and the bitter anticipation that comes from knowing a confrontation is no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. She slowed, considering whether to take the long way around, but the moment she turned onto her block, the cart jerked forward and began moving toward her with a speed that was uncharacteristic for the quiet, narrow lane. At first, she thought he might simply be positioning himself to flag her down, but the way he held his line, dead center in the lane, forcing her to either stop or swerve, told her otherwise. She brought her car to a halt, keeping her foot lightly on the brake, watching him close the distance. When he was within 15 feet, he suddenly veered to the side, swung the cart in a tight arc, and accelerated directly at the front of her vehicle. This time, there was no mistaking the intent, no veneer of ambiguity. She shifted into reverse, the tires spinning slightly on the damp asphalt, and backed up as quickly as she dared while keeping her eyes locked on him. The cart closed in until there was less than a car length between them before he braked hard, the screech of rubber on wet pavement sharp in the still air. In that frozen second, her hands clenched on the wheel, she realized this was the moment he had been driving toward all along, the moment where his harassment crossed the final threshold into something undeniable and dangerous. She threw the car into park, took out her phone, and without lowering her gaze, began to dial 911. She spoke clearly and precisely, giving her location and describing the attempted collision, making sure every word was audible. Jason sat there in the cart, engine still humming, eyes fixed on her with an expression that was equal parts challenge and calculation. When she finished the call, she took a slow breath, shifted into drive, and pulled past him, forcing him to edge his cart toward the curb to let her by. She parked in her driveway and didn't leave the car until she saw the patrol vehicle turn onto the street a few minutes later, lights flashing softly against the low clouds. 2 officers spoke with her first, taking her statement in full detail, then approached Jason, who had by then parked his cart neatly in front of his house as though nothing unusual had happened. From where she stood, she could see him gesturing with open palms, his voice carrying in a tone of exaggerated calm. But when the officers returned, their questions were different this time, more pointed, more focused on whether she wanted to pursue charges for reckless endangerment and harassment. She said yes, without hesitation. Her attorney arrived within the hour, having been alerted by her call right after contacting the police, and together they provided the officers with the growing archive of documents, photographs, and logs she had kept. The file was thick enough now to paint a clear picture of escalation, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Allison saw the shift in official posture from polite acknowledgement to active intervention. The officers informed Jason that, pending investigation, he was to have no contact with her and was prohibited from approaching her property, a restriction they made clear would be enforced. As the patrol car finally pulled away and the wind began to pick up ahead of the storm, Allison stood at her window, watching the empty street. The fear was still there, coiled tight beneath her ribs, but it was joined now by a hard, steady relief. Jason had forced the conflict into the open where it could no longer be hidden behind gossip and falsified notices, and while she knew the legal process would take time, the balance had shifted. She was no longer the one on the defensive. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted in ways Allison had not dared hope for during the long months of quiet intimidation. The police investigation moved forward steadily, supported by the thick file her attorney had assembled and the formal statements taken from several residents who, emboldened by the fact that someone had finally stood up to Jason, came forward to describe similar incidents that they had endured or witnessed but had been too wary to report. His once constant presence on the streets disappeared overnight. The golf cart that had become an unspoken emblem of his control sat unused in his driveway, and the sight of it, inert and gathering dust beneath the carport, carried a strange sense of closure. The official order barring him from contact remained in place while charges for harassment and reckless endangerment worked their way through the legal system, and the administrative board, faced with the undeniable evidence of his behavior, voted to remove him from his position, citing gross misconduct and abuse of authority. The notices, the cones, the petty obstructions, all of it stopped, replaced by a cautious but growing normalcy that allowed Allison to move through her days without scanning every corner for his shadow. She knew better than to imagine that people like Jason simply disappeared from the world, but she also understood that she had done what was necessary to dismantle his hold over her life, and that of others. Standing on her porch one clear morning, the air brisk with the first hint of autumn, she looked out at the quiet street and felt something she had not in months, the unguarded stillness of a place that once again belonged to its residents rather than to the will of one man,